Welcome to In Bloom. I am your host, Michaela Richmond, and this is a pro-humanity podcast. Hello, welcome to the In Bloom podcast. I am your host, Michaela Richmond, and on today's episode, we're going to talk about man's search for meaning. So this is a book. It's a book by a Holocaust survivor, and I thought it was perfectly fitting to start off our journey on this podcast with a look into this book because it definitely does encapsulate a lot of aspects of what I do believe about humanity, and I think it's a good starting point. I think it gives you a different perspective on how to look at your own life, and this is very important. I think we get caught up in going about our day-to-day so much that we don't really think about existence. Like, we don't think about our own existence. We don't think about the fact that we exist and how crazy that is even. I think sometimes it takes interesting circumstances to draw that out of us, to draw that insight, to draw that thought process out of us. And for Viktor Frankl, those interesting circumstances were the concentration camps. He was in 4 total concentration camps, and before he was in those concentration camps, he was actually a psychoanalyst and a neurologist, and he worked with a lot of mentally ill patients. What he realized in treating so many mentally ill patients was that most mentally ill patients were suffering because they had lost their touch with meaning. Like, they didn't know why they mattered. They didn't know why life mattered. And he realized that one of the greatest works was to find somebody's meaning, like to reintroduce them to what was already innate to them. Throughout this explanation, I'm going to basically lay out the frameworks for why you don't get to choose whether or not you are meaningful. That was one of the main takeaways that I had from this study, was just that you don't get to choose whether or not you're meaningful. Your life holds meaning anyways. And that's why Frankl had to reintroduce this concept of meaning to his patients, because it's not about finding your meaning or like creating your meaning or, doing all of these interesting things to go out and, start something or have God tell you that you need to do this because whatever. It's about rediscovering what's already innate to you. And I think that that's so necessary for a lot of people to hear because it becomes easy to live in a world where you see so many people who act like they have purpose and who act like they have a meaning. And if you don't know what to do, if you don't know where to go, like, you just look at those people and you're wondering, what am I doing wrong? And I've definitely been there at some points in my life. And it's absolutely liberating whenever you realize that you don't have to make your meaning. You just have to recognize the meaning that is already there and then fully embrace it and fully step into it and live that out. And then as you do that, you'll start to see different things unfold. So I'm going to get into that. I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by all of those different things, and you'll have a much more clear understanding of everything that I just said by the end of this. So stay tuned. One slight side note. Viktor Frankl did not want to publish this book under his name, which is really interesting. Whenever he came back from the concentration camps and re-entered into society, he decided to pour everything into his work and this book. He realized that there were a lot of questions that people had and a lot of things that people were thinking and wondering about, and his insight into both the camps and psychology would really illuminate a lot of insights for people. So he knew that this book needed to be written, but he didn't really want to write it with his name because it wasn't about him. Like, this book was about the contents of it. It was about what people could learn from it. It was about how people could take these lessons and apply them to their lives. After talking with some friends, he realized that he needed to publish it under his name because whenever you could really imagine who this person was that experienced it, because of his suffering and because of the fact that he gave us this gift of this book. So he's given us this ability to live through him. Isaac Newton has a quote about standing on the shoulders of giants. And basically, it's about the fact that whenever other people learn something, it does you more to just take what they've learned and apply it to your life than it does for you to have to relearn it and then add on to that. So he's given us this gift of this book so that we can take everything that he's learned and everything that these people went through and learned about humanity and human suffering and the human condition and human nature, etc., and just apply it to our own lives. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit before I explain all of these different phases and just give a very, very, very quick synopsis for whoever needs it about, I guess, like what happened. So basically there was a dude, his name was Hitler. He was extreme is a light way to put it. He had all kinds of ideas and he was honestly probably a little bit mentally disturbed. But he had all kinds of ideas, and then because he was a very, very compelling speaker and because he had a very strong personality, he rose his way to the top of German leadership and pretty much convinced everybody that all of the problems that existed in society were the Jews' fault. He created a divide within society and absolutely messed up everything. It started with these armbands and IDs. Then it went into segregation of physical locations. So they moved all of the Jews out of their houses and into the ghettos. And then afterwards, it was mass extermination pretty much. So this is definitely not a light topic, but I had to explain that as a sort of precursor to everything that we're going to go into. So throughout the whole, Nazi Holocaust process, they experienced 3 different phases, each one very specific and each one very interesting in terms of psychology. He explains that in the first phase, whenever everybody was coming into the camps, they were in a state of shock. Like, nobody could believe what was occurring. They were like, what is happening? When is this joke going to be over? How is this even possible? How is this real? They lost all their friends. They lost all of their belongings. They were being forcibly separated from everybody they knew and loved. And it was just like, how is this happening? There's a concept, it's called the Overton Window, and it's basically that as you move the bar forward ever so slowly, humans adapt. And because humans adapt, they don't recognize how far you're pushing them to the edge until they're at the edge. That's pretty much exactly what happened with these people. They are in the camps. They're like, whoa, hold up a moment here. Like, everything else before this was kind of uncomfortable, but this is a whole other level. So they were obviously in shock, and what came with the shock was this thing which he termed Delusion of Reprieve, and that's basically that they had an irrational hope that at the last minute they might be saved. Like somebody's going to come in and swoop up and be like, oh no, this is all not real, just kidding, you can go back home. And everybody had this experience of this delusion of reprieve where they thought maybe at the last minute, maybe, just maybe. And after, that turned out to be false, they experienced a type of curiosity. They were like, well, actually, now that it's set in, how is this actually possible? How is this possible that we allowed this to happen or that these people hate us? What did we actually do? And so they experienced curiosity. And finally, the last expression that accompanied this first stage of entering the camps was this weird sense of humor. So in order to cope with everything that was going on, they needed some sort of a defense mechanism or something to help them to cope. And they used humor. They had been stripped of literally everything. And it was insane because everything that used to seem so important to them no longer seemed as important. And because of that, I think that humor was the only thing that they could turn to. Frankl said humor, more than anything else in the human makeup, can afford an aloofness and the ability to rise above any situation, even if only for a few seconds. So kind of like whenever you just experience a really bad day and then at the end of it, all you can do is laugh because you're like that was awful. I would like to take everything that he explained in the first phase and just really, really, really think deeply about how I would feel if I were in that situation. In those situations, whenever things are taken away from you and whenever you are left with very little, you realize what you actually want. And I think it would do us a lot of justice to actually think about that right now. Like, what serves us? What does not serve us? What do we need? What do we think we need versus what do we actually need? How do we live our lives in a way that gives more to what we actually need and what we actually love, and gives less to what we just fill our lives with for the sake of, societal approval or to feel better or whatever. If you were in that situation, if you were stripped of everything, what would you still want? So the second phase of camp, this is whenever everybody has settled in. They are accepting the situation that they're in. They are in these camps. They are surrounded by, people that they either do know or don't know. They are surrounded by absolutely horrendous treatment and awful conditions, starvation, sleeplessness. People are getting sick all of the time. People are dying all around them. And Frankl explains, apathy was the main symptom of the second phase. It was a necessary mechanism of self-defense, and it made their reality dim. All of their emotions and efforts were focused on only one task, and that was to survive. And this is interesting because at this point, whenever all of their efforts, emotions, thoughts, actions, etc., were beginning to be geared towards survival, their minds shifted as well. Frankl expresses this change by basically explaining that such a state of strain, coupled with a constant necessity of concentrating on the task of staying alive, forced the prisoner's inner life down to a primitive level. And so whenever I first heard this, I was like, okay, well, but what does he mean by primitive? Because that's important. And he goes further and he explains that the regression was basically a retreat to a more primitive form of mental life. This prisoner's mental thought processes, his desires, his wishes, they became obvious, and his dreams were basically of, food and of, he said, nice warm baths. And it's interesting because Frankl goes further into this concept of the mind. He goes further into this concept of the mind because of the fact that these people were placed in such a circumstance that forced them into this awful, primitive, lower ordered thinking and state of mind. And what that brought out of them, that was the key differentiator between people that survived and people that didn't. And so he explains basically that in the beginning, whenever everybody was coming into the camps, they'd look around and they'd realize that people were dying, and they would make assumptions about who would survive and who would not. And most of those assumptions were that the biggest and strongest would survive. But over time, they realized that it wasn't the biggest and the strongest that survived. It was the people that were able to escape into their minds whenever they were doing difficult tasks, whenever they were experiencing some pain in their outer world. They would escape into their minds and begin to think about the things and the people that they loved. And this helped them. It gave them strength. He recalled that love went beyond the physical person. He says that it finds its deepest meaning in its spiritual being, its inner self. Whether or not the person is actually present, whether or not he is still alive, ceases to be of any importance. So he said this in light of a man that he recalled. There was this man who, in the midst of great suffering, decided to make a promise with God that even though he would suffer, he would give it up for his wife. He didn't know whether or not his wife was alive, but this sacrificial prayer made everything that he did more intentional. It was all for her. Everything that he did was for her. And he thought about her, and he dreamt about her. And in the fact that he was doing this for her, it didn't matter whether or not she was still alive. It gave strength to his own actions and his own resolve. And I think that's extremely important. There's so much to learn about the inner life and about actually cultivating that for yourself. It's interesting because extreme conditions usually heighten or magnify what's already there. And so if you have an inner spiritual life, it's going to magnify that. If you have bad habits, it's going to magnify that. If you have, any extreme condition is going to magnify whatever's there. And so for these people that had this inner spiritual life, it magnified their inner spiritual life. And Frankl explains this by saying that as the inner life of the prisoner tended to become more intense, he also experienced the beauty of art and nature as never before. Under their influence, he sometimes even forgot his own frightful circumstances. He also says this intensification of inner life helped the prisoner find refuge from the emptiness, desolation, and spiritual poverty of his existence. What was crazy to me about these two things was that, I had never expected for the camps to be a place that people could find deep beauty and art. That would have never crossed my mind. How could a place that experienced and held so much suffering and pain actually be a place of such spiritual growth and depth? And I think it's because At a certain point, whenever everything has seemed so bleak for so long, whenever you get hints and tiny gifts of beauty and of art and of goodness, those stand out. So maybe it was just a beautiful sunrise, or maybe it was an act of kindness. I don't know. I assume that it's a different form of art than what I would normally think as painting art. Like I'd assume that whenever he says that there were forms of art in the camp, that it was a different type of art. So I don't know exactly what he means by that, but it makes a lot of sense. The idea that art and beauty were present in the camps forces us to kind of look at our own lives and ask, where do we not see the art and the beauty? If something could be found as beautiful in such a dreary circumstance, I think that there are a lot of things that we don't appreciate as beautiful in our own lives, and we should. How many things do you actually appreciate as beautiful in your life? If people can go through a concentration camp and still find things that they see as beautiful, if they can experience beauty and art, how is it that you can't experience beauty in your own life and in your own day-to-day when you are amongst so many beautiful things? You literally just have to step outside of yourself, step outside of your narrow frame of mind, and stop looking with tunnel vision and gaze at what exists. It's a gift. So to continue, I'm actually going to do a complete 360, and we're going to go from talking about beauty and art to going to suffering and meaninglessness. I want to preface this section with a quote by Frankl. He explains that under the influence of a world which no longer recognized the value of human life and human dignity, which had robbed man of his will and made him an object to be exterminated, under this influence, the personal ego finally suffered a loss of values. The camps were set up so that they would devalue these people. The whole premise behind Hitler's platform was that Jews were not people. They were not on the same level. They didn't have the same dignity. They were not as valuable. And so these camps just solidified that. And the camps were designed to make these people essentially animalistic. For some reason, they could get it in their minds that these people were valuable enough to do work, but not valuable enough to exist, which is interesting. Frankl basically explained that if a man in a concentration camp did not struggle against this, in a last effort to save his self-respect, he lost the feeling of being an individual, a being with a mind, with inner freedom and personal value. He thought of himself then as only a part of an enormous mass of people. His existence descended to the level of an animal life. I'm going to take a moment here, because this is the most important thing I think I will talk about for the rest of my life. Human life matters. There are things that are indelible to humans, but the interesting thing is that these camps were designed to try and take that away. And in every single type of Holocaust and every single type of extreme demoralization of human life, the focal point is taking those things away. The things that are supposed to be indelible, the things that are supposed to be written on man's heart or written on man's soul or just innate to his being. Those things are always the things that are taken away first. Why? Because they are fundamental to man's being. If man does not understand these things and hold them very closely to his heart, he cannot survive in the same way. It's interesting to me because this is not a time-specific, history-specific problem. This is a human problem. People, even today, wonder whether or not they are valued, whether or not they are of value, whether or not they have dignity, whether or not they are free, etc. And this should not be the case. I firmly believe that people should not be wondering anymore whether or not they have value, whether or not they are free, whether or not they, have these internal things that make them important. Like, we are important because we are human. You don't have to have anything else. You don't have to be anything else. You don't have to show up as anything else. Like, you in your being are important, and that is the foundation. And that needs to be permeated throughout culture. That needs to be absolutely fundamental. By merit of your humanity, you are of value, you are free, you are dignified, and you are so important. Frankl observed, "The consciousness of one's inner life is anchored in higher, more spiritual things and cannot be shaken by camp life. But how many free men, let alone prisoners, possess it? No thing, no person, this cannot be taken away from a person, but a person gives it up." He explained that the consciousness of one's inner value is anchored in these higher, more spiritual things, which means that because they are above the more worldly things, they can't be taken away. But there has to be consciousness of them. So you have to have awareness of that. And then because you're aware that it exists outside of anything material, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whenever people tell you that you don't matter or that you're only worth what you do. None of that matters because you're conscious of the fact that your value as a human being, as a person, it lies outside of all of that. It lies outside of where you are, what you do. It lies outside of how old you are. Anything. It lies outside of that. And this is why it's so interesting that the camps were set up the way that they were. In these awful conditions with these awful people telling these poor individuals that they are nothing, that they are worth nothing, that they are not free, that they are less than animals, that they have no dignity, that they don't matter. In those conditions, so many of these people began to believe it. So if they had at one point been aware of their value, if they were conscious of the fact that their value was anchored in something that was non-material, if at one point they had that, the job of the camps was to convince them to let go of that, to rewire their neural circuits and rewire their beliefs about themselves and about the world and about their value. And effectively done. I mean, a lot of people experienced a lot of hopelessness because of the fact that these messages started to get to them. At a certain point, if somebody starts to tell you and just continues to repeat to you that you are nothing, eventually, unless you are so rooted in your beliefs about your value, you will start to believe it. And so that's why it's so important to really solidify your understanding of who you are as an individual. What does your humanity mean about you? What does it give you? What does it say about you and what you are worth and what you hold inside of yourself? That is primary in everything that you're going to do going forward. Some people might wonder, these people were in really bad conditions. They were in awful circumstances. Of course, they let go of their value and they let go of their awareness of this value, and this is inevitable. And Frankl did think about this, and because he was a scientist, he wondered. And this is his quote. He said, "To those wondering whether or not man is no more but a product of many conditional and environmental factors, be they of a biological, psychological, or sociological nature," well, he says, "the experiences of life show that man does have a choice of action. There were enough examples of a heroic nature which prove that apathy could be overcome, irritability suppressed. Man can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible conditions of psychic and physical stress." Basically, he acknowledges this point, that the circumstances do play a factor, but there were enough conditions in which somebody did something that was so contradictory to what the conditions might ask that it proves that you don't have to react to the conditions that you're put into. There were people that gave their last meal. There were people that tried to make people laugh, or you have examples of the saints. There are so many saints that came out of concentration camps, for example, Maximilian Kolbe. And he explained that there were so many people that were just heroes in these camps because they made difficult decisions and choices. And by virtue of that, he stands firm in the fact that you do get to choose. One of his most famous quotes is that the last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in a given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And this is interesting because it all depends on your value system. And this is why values are so important. The people that showed up in the camps, the people that became saints, the people that went so far as to do good in the worst of circumstances, those people did not begin doing good in the camps. Just as they did not begin to have and cultivate their inner spiritual and inner mental life in the camps, These people that did good in the camps did good beforehand. And they had created and cultivated this value system that had made their standard a certain level so that whenever they got to the camps and whenever they were tested, their standard was higher than everything else, and they did not let themselves falter. And I think that's important to create a standard. Create a standard in your life. Decide how you want to be, decide who you want to be, decide what your standard will be, and then implement that and live by them. And then whenever circumstances come, and they will inevitably come, where you fall to the level of your standard. I also want to say that it's not about just creating standards for yourself. It's about knowing where those values are rooted. Nietzsche has a quote. It's something along the lines of, a man who has any why can bear any how. And I think that everybody needs to really, really get clear on their why. Why do you do this? Why does this matter to you? Think about your values. He ends this second phase by saying, every day, every hour offers the opportunity to make a decision. So in this next and final phase, it's the reaction after liberation. So this is an interesting one. So after people were liberated, they had just experienced the worst experiences of their life, and now they're free, and they can't believe it. And not in like a figurative, I can't believe it. Like realistically, they could not believe it. He recalled his own experience, saying, we had literally lost the ability to feel pleased and had to relearn it slowly. Psychologically, what was happening to the liberated prisoners was called depersonalization. Everything appeared unreal, unlikely, as in a dream. We could not believe it was true. And that makes so much sense. Like you almost wonder if your eyes are deceiving you. If you've died and gone to heaven, you're like, what is happening here? Maybe this is a fever dream and you're just going to wake up and it's going to be as bad as it was yesterday. And you almost don't trust yourself, because if you allow yourself to be happy for a moment and then you wake up, like that's the most disappointing thing. So then they just didn't allow themselves to believe it for a while. And he explained, step for step, I progressed until again, I became a human being. And here again, we see this thread of humanity. There was something about enjoying life and experiencing life that is so fundamental to being human. And he understood this after having experienced everything that he had, after being so demoralized, after seeing so many people die and so many people just decline in their faculties. So his family had been killed by the camps. And of course, it was extremely difficult to enter back into society. You know, you enter back into this world and it's nothing like the one you left. Your possessions, not there. Everybody who you used to know that was Jewish, not there. The people that you used to know that facilitated and you are going to the camps, well, obviously you're not going to be close with them anymore. And he explained that they experienced a type of bitterness because they came back into these societies and people didn't know how to react. Like, a segment of the population had been gone for years. Then they return, and to some degree, it's your fault. There was a part that a lot of people played in either doing something for Nazi Germany or not doing something against it. And because of that, there's this sort of guilt, but also, what do you do? And they responded, most of the non-Jewish citizens, by just saying, we didn't know about it, or we've suffered also. And I mean, I guess I can understand them. To some degree, there are certain things that you just don't know what to do about them. And I can understand on the other side how those responses, how these non-Jewish citizens who didn't experience these atrocities, not knowing how to react, hurt them. So after the bitterness, they experienced disillusionment, which was basically like anger with fate. Kind of like, God, how can you do this to us? They've just experienced so much suffering, and then they get back and they realize that suffering doesn't have a limit. You can continue suffering. You can continue being hurt by the world. And that hurt them a lot as well. So Frankl comes back into this world, you know, the bitterness, the disillusionment, and that's the end of phase 3. But he takes it a step further. He had been in the camps. He had been thinking about his work, and that's what kept him going, the thought of his work and the thought of his wife. And he decides to just fully dive into everything that he wants to say. And here's where we get back to the psychology of meaning. So again, for anybody who forgot, Frankl was a psychoanalyst and neurologist, and his primary field of study was this field called logotherapy. It is kind of similar to psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis is retrospective and introspective. So it looks at your past and it looks at, what's going on inside of you. Whereas logotherapy is focused on the future. It's focused on future goals. In the camps, he had learned and witnessed that any attempt to restore a man's inner strength had first to succeed in showing him some future goal. Frankl realized it's not about what we expect from life, but rather what life expects from us. And to explain this further, he gave this example of this man, and he was on the verge of giving up. He was so done with the existence and the camp and everything. And they started talking, and he explained that his son had escaped prior to the concentration camp, and his son was waiting for him. And they continued to explain that to him until the man realized that he didn't have a choice. He didn't have a choice on whether or not to continue because his son was waiting for him. His son expected him to return, and he couldn't give up. It's interesting because in this exact place that you're in, there are things that are expected of you. It doesn't matter, what you expect of yourself. It doesn't matter if you feel like it. It doesn't matter if you like where you're going or where you've been. It doesn't matter what you expect, what you think you should expect, whatever. All that matters is what life expects of you. And I will explain this further because I think that it needs to be explained. Life gives you purpose. There are things that life asks of you and ways that it asks you to show up. Frankl says life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answers to the problems in front of you and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets before you. These tasks, and therefore the meaning of life, differ from man to man and moment to moment. Life has given you a purpose. And what I mean by that, what he means by that, is that it's so easy to go about your life and to think that these individual tasks that you have to complete are irrelevant. Like you have to show up and get up in the morning. You have to go out of your door and you have to get in your car and you have to go to work and you have to come home and you have to talk to your family members and your friends. And then you have to do all of these other things. And it seems like every little task is so inconsequential, but you cannot know the impact that you have. You cannot know what you've done to help other people. You can't know how somebody's life looks exactly as it does because of your role in it. And because of that, you don't get to choose whether or not your life has meaning. Because of the fact that you exist and you interact with people and you have unique perspectives and you have a unique experience and unique knowledge to add to this world. Like there's no way that you could not be of value. And I think that that's interesting. It's such an interesting point because intuitively I knew that. But whenever Frankl explained it, it hit on a different level. I realized that so much of life is spent reacting to things. So much of life is spent doing because we know we need to do. But it's not spent zooming out and realizing that it's not just about needing to do because you want a good life or because, you want something material. I don't know. Doing is important because you don't know how the doing fits together. You cannot understand how the puzzle pieces will fit. You can't understand how you working this one job that you don't like, or you doing school at this one point, or you taking this opportunity or moving across the country, or whatever you want to do, whatever you're doing right now. You can't understand how they're going to help you out. You can't understand how they're going to impact other people. You cannot understand. So you just have to do. It's interesting because we talk about, life and purpose, and in today's culture, we glorify these ideas of success and becoming something and doing something grand. But it's difficult because I don't actually think the majority of people know what they want to do or who they want to be. And you almost feel wrong for not knowing that. Because we have the ability to choose, it's difficult because nobody tells us what to do. People don't light our path with these lights and say, this is exactly what you need to follow. People give us freedom. They give us the space to make choices. And that's scary because we fear making the wrong choices. And it's scary because we've bought into the lie that once you've made a choice, you can't go backwards. Like almost nothing is absolutely set in stone. The point is that because people don't know who they want to be or know what they want to do, and because it seems like everybody does or you should, the two defaults are, as Frankl explained, conformism or totalitarianism. Conformism is basically, of course, following the crowd. And the second, totalitarianism, he explains, is basically just having somebody else point you in the right direction. Like, what do you want me to do? Okay, cool, I'll do that. In this exact time of your life and stage, with the given knowledge and experience that you have, what are the things that life could be asking of you to do in this moment? Frankl basically has the formula for discovering meaning. And basically, according to logotherapy, you can discover meaning in life in 3 ways. Number 1, by creating a work or doing a deed. Number 2, by experiencing something or someone. And number 3, by the attitude that you take toward unavoidable suffering. So I will go into each one into more depth. The first one, creating a work or doing a deed, is basically exactly what I was just explaining. You don't get to create meaning. Not really. You get to discover it. Meaning exists all around you. Meaning is. It is interwoven into existence and into the world. So you don't get to create it, but you do get to discover it. And you discover it by doing different things that bring you closer to it. And creating a work or doing a deed is a great way to discover meaning because it's basically assigning yourself a mission. So you take something that needs to be done, something that you decide you can do, like I was explaining before, given what you know, what you can do, this current set of circumstances you're in, what you like to do, etc., and you commit to it because it needs to be done and you can do it. And basically, it's just characterized by deciding and by showing up. It can be becoming a doctor, a lawyer, a astrophysicist. Maybe it's honing your craft as a musician or practicing a sport. It could even be volunteering every weekend. That's one way to find meaning. So the second way you can discover meaning is by either experiencing something or encountering someone. Experiencing something, basically he means something transcendental, which is like it takes you outside of yourself. This is pretty much the whole of this second point. Get yourself into a state of mind where you're not thinking about yourself. It's something deeply good, true, or beautiful. Those are the transcendentals. It's kind of like the concept of, you walking into a beautiful church in Europe or the Colosseum or the Parthenon, or just like you walk into some place or you look at some beautiful paintings and you're just like, wow. And it takes you outside of yourself. And for a moment, you stop. That is one way you can discover meaning. And then also by encountering someone. And what he means by encountering someone is by encountering and experiencing another human being in his or her own uniqueness. He explains that no one can become fully aware of the very essence of another human being unless he loves him. When was the last time you experienced someone so fully? I don't think we do this very often. I think that a lot of interactions become very surface level, and it's very easy, and that's okay. But if you can't infuse some sort of deep desire to know somebody into your conversation and into your experience of them, it's not real love. We should strive to do that more often because it takes us outside of ourselves. It shows us both who we want to be and who we could be, and it brings us closer to what is good in the world. Anytime that I've ever experienced real love, good love, deep love, love that makes me feel known and seen and really appreciated, it always transforms the way that I view the world in that moment. So surround yourself with people that really want to know you. Lastly, you can discover meaning by the attitude that you take toward suffering. It was interesting because whenever he was reflecting on the camps, he explained that at some point, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds meaning, such as the meaning of sacrifice. And that went back to the point of the man with his wife who gave up all of his suffering for her. Once you recognize that suffering has a purpose, it's no longer suffering, but more so trials and tribulation, I guess. He says that suffering had become a task on which they did not want to turn their backs. They had realized its hidden opportunities for achievement. And this was interesting to me. It was interesting because they suffered so much. I wouldn't have expected for them to not want to turn their back on suffering, for them to want to embrace it. There's a lot of hidden growth in suffering, and I think that's one aspect of it. And I think another aspect of it was the fact that even in the suffering, a person was completely unique. Like, his experience of the suffering was completely unique, and the way that he chose to bear that suffering was completely unique. There's two different threads that I would like to go down on this topic of suffering. The first is that no one can escape their uniqueness. It was interesting that he pointed out the fact that even in suffering, a person is unique. And though they were experiencing the same camp, nobody had the exact same experience of the camp. And so in that, suffering was one of the things that rooted them to this truth that they are unique. Like, they alone experienced this exact type of suffering, this exact experience of suffering. And then the second thing that I wanted to think about was the fact that no triumph can ever be had without some level of suffering. Like, if nobody has to suffer, then there's no triumph. It's just a straight line. Congratulations, you did nothing. But whenever people have to suffer, the triumph is celebrated. It's applauded. It's appreciated. And Frankl experienced his suffering, but in his mind was his work. And whenever he came out of the camps and published his book, that was his hero's journey. There are definitely other things that he did, and there are definitely other ways that he mattered, but the suffering added to the triumph that was this book. And it's interesting because every person is their own hero. Like, you may not think about this, but in your life, you are the main character. You're the narrator, you're the main character. You're going through it all and experiencing it all. And in 10 years, in 20 years, you'll look back and be like, wow, almost as if you're playing a highlight reel. I think about my childhood and I see it in my head as if it were a movie. Like, it's so familiar and yet distant. And that's amazing. But you have to remember, purpose is innate to you. Purpose is innate to you as an individual. Purpose is innate to you as a human being. You don't get to choose whether or not you have purpose. You do have purpose. And this life that you're living has purpose. And the interactions that you have in a day-to-day exchange, in a day-to-day fashion, they matter and they're important. He gave some advice. He said, live as though you were living for the second time and had acted as wrongly the first time as you were about to act now. Imagine if you go through your day-to-day in a haze, thinking about all the things you have to do, you're thinking about all of your priorities and deadlines, and then you just stop and you just look up at the sky and you take a breath and you look at the trees, look at the birds, and you look at the people that are going around behind you and in front of you and next to you, and you really take in this moment. Just recognize who these people are around you. Stop thinking about doing for a moment and just appreciate your being. Like, you exist. Congratulations. The fact that you exist is absolutely incredulous. You exist because your parents existed. And they had conceived you in the exact same moment that they conceived you. And their parents had conceived them in the exact same moment that they conceived them. And their parents met. And so on and so forth. And we can get even further into why your existence is absolutely incredulous, but just begin there. Like, you exist. Congratulations. And that's why whenever I say existence matters and your life matters, there's an added level of truth behind that, because the fact that you exist is crazy. It's amazing. It's a great thing. And each moment that you live, each moment that you're here on earth, each moment that you experience this life and you're making decisions, it gives you the opportunity to decide how you will show up, how you will interact with this world, who you will be, how you will use this gift of life and of existence. And I know that sometimes it's hard to show up for yourself. So if you're not going to show up for yourself, then just show up for others. Like I said before, you cannot even possibly conceive how you have impacted other people's lives. You cannot fathom how you've touched people, how you have helped them or been anything in their life, even insignificant. Like, I still remember some strangers that have done just sweet acts of kindness for me. You never know how much you've impacted people. So if you cannot muster to do it for yourself, show up for others. There are things in your life that will ask you to show up. There are circumstances that will ask something of you. And if you've prepared to show up, if you've raised your standard over time and rooted that in some deep why, you will be able to show up in those moments. You will be able to show up in your worst moments. I want to go back to the idea of extremes. And it is interesting that extremes bring out the worst and the best in people. Frankl thought about this and said that it created both the men who created the gas chambers and those that became the saints. And this is true. Depth of character is developed over time, and it's magnified by circumstances. To conclude this episode, I would like to just give some last thoughts. This life is a good life. This life is a gift. It is not the most beautiful. It is definitely full of suffering and full of sorrow. But it's also full of beauty and art and goodness and truth. And I don't think that we pay enough attention to that. And I think that there are far too many people in this world that lack a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose, and they've just given up. And they're giving up. And they don't recognize how they, as a human being, are so unique and so important. I'll leave you with this. You have so much in you. So much potential. So much life. So much spirit. So much to give to the world. It's not something you can choose. It's not something you can decide to just throw away. But you can decide whether or not you're going to recognize it. Your life is a reflection of your choices. And this world becomes a reflection of the aggregate of choices, so choose wisely. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of In Bloom, and I hope that you found this episode enriching. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you would like to write a rating or a review, that would be fantastic. You can also follow me at In Bloom Podcast.
You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference.